Dawn Bueller grew up on the Kansas River.
Our farmhouse, you could walk to the river from it.
Sometimes, and I really envy her for this, she'd even sleep on a sandbar in the middle of the water overnight. Her dad would ferry her and her family out to it in a boat, leave them there with their tents, and then pick them up the next morning. How did you feel those nights?
Peaceful. Was quiet. The stars in the sky shine so bright. You felt like you were in the last wild place in Kansas. You could go out to this sandbar in the middle of the river and be away from everything.
This was actually a pretty rare childhood experience in Kansas. This state doesn't have much public land or river access compared to the rest of the country. And I mean, in the late 70s, early 80s, there was hardly any public access to the Kansas River. But her family happened to be working 2,000 acres right next to it, so she did have access. That was in a town called DeSoto, west of Kansas City. And when she wasn't busy doing farm chores, the river beckoned.
Back when nobody was on it.
Hardly anybody. And actually not just because of the lack of access. For a long time, people had been conditioned to keep away.
Yeah, the rivers and streams were so polluted prior to 1972.
1972, that's the Federal Clean Water Act. Cities, factories, etc. weren't allowed anymore to use rivers as basically magic receptacles that would whisk away anything we didn't know how or didn't want to clean up. But yeah, before then, the water was gross.
It was not uncommon to see dead cattle in Kansas City down by the Stockyards district. And the raw sewage, unbelievable for like my generation, where the Clean Water Act passed when I was a kid. And so I never saw how bad it was.
So regulating sewage and other discharges was a huge win. And today, the Kansas River is pretty reliably good quality and quite the place for a year-round kayaker like Dawn.
If you're quiet, you go slowly, you can see otter. The beavers sometimes, they will stop and freeze in place on the bank and then wait till you go on by before they dive into the water. Kingfisher diving into the river, bald eagles with their catch of some fish on a sandbar and dragging it across. There's a record 27 nesting pair of bald eagles now.
Some of these species you used to never see there because pollution and overhunting in the past took such a toll. So a trip down the Kansas River today can give you a lot of reasons to smile and feel good about the environment, which is great. But U.S. rivers like this one are still facing quite a few problems we need to address. So in this episode, we're tackling, well, I don't know, what do you call them? What's your favorite term for this awful thing?
I tend to refer to them as legacy dump sites.
Legacy dump sites. What I imagine is like a place where people are going in the middle of the night and they're dumping bags of trash. But actually, these are collections of like really, to me, unexpected, odd objects that have strange backstories behind them. One of them is the battery cases. Tell me about the battery cases.
These cases have been in the river for a very long time. We're talking 60 years plus.
Just like thousands of black cases jutting
Thousands.
out of these gorgeous golden sandbars.
Yes, absolutely. It just looks like little black dots all over the sandbars, and the bulk of them are between Manhattan and St. George.
These are hard rubber cases for military vehicle batteries, just without the batteries. So Dawn is the head of a nonprofit called Friends of the Caw. It's a small group that focuses on the river. And in 2017, she and a dozen volunteers were like, well, we'll just get rid of these eyesores. They headed out in canoes and set to clawing these battery cases out of the sandbars, but
they were so heavy.
Yeah.
It was unbelievable how heavy they were.
They loaded as many as they could, like 3,000 pounds of them, and paddled them away.
8 or 9 miles with our canoes full.
It took all day.
Oh, every muscle in my body ached. We were so sore.
And their haul was just a little fraction of the battery cases out there. Oh man, did it feel like you were like a little naive about what you were getting into that first day?
100%. 100%. When we got to the end, I was the one that stood on the ramp and said, this isn't going to work. I got to find another way.
And eventually they did. They figured out a way to multiply their efforts. And 8 years later, they've pulled about 35 tons of battery cases. Tons. Now they're the kings of pulling weird stuff out of the river. And they've got an ambitious goal to clean up all these decades-old legacy trash sites, as Dawn calls them. Not just the dumb battery case graveyard, all the other stuff too. And they're trying to do it by 2030. From the Kansas News Service and KCUR studios, you're listening to Up From Dust. I'm Celia Llopis-Jepsen. The Kansas River has seen a lot. Over the decades, the environmental challenges keep changing. Trash is one, and it has pushed a group of kayak-loving volunteers to strategize, organize, and build something much bigger than themselves. Across the river basin, they've strung together an allegiance of city and county governments, construction companies, utilities, college students, hunters, fishermen, and they are staring down that 2030 goal. It once felt impossible, but with more and more hands on deck, it's starting to feel within their reach. Okay, we need to learn a few things about the Kansas River, plus where the heck all this decades-old trash came from. So, the Kansas River drains a good chunk of Colorado and Nebraska and about half of Kansas. It is a big river basin. And now you might think, Colorado, so it starts in the Rockies. It does not. The origins of this river system are raindrops falling on the windswept high plains.
And so we have this longest prairie-based river in the world.
That's one of the things Dawn loves about it.
What's beautiful about the river are these braided sandbars. You'll see the river wind its way through these golden sandbars, and it's just spectacular. Some of the most beautiful images I've ever seen of the river are from drone.
The river has two names, the Kansas and the Kaw. Both refer to the Kaw Nation, also known as the Kanza, now based in Oklahoma, a tribe with about 3,900 members.
They lived along the river. This was their part of their subsistence, and it was their community, and it was where they lived.
And the story of how the Kaw Nation was treated is brutal. White people forcibly removed them from their millions of acres of territory. Their means of livelihood was taken. They suffered starvation and disease. By the late 1800s, only about 200 Kaw had survived, down from thousands. And these survivors were forced out of Kansas, the state that is named after them. And gradually, over the decades, the new communities around the Kansas River developed a very different relationship to it. As cities grew and grew, this is when the river started taking in so much raw sewage, discharge from slaughterhouses, etc. And also, people became removed from the river, mostly didn't interact with it, which makes it easy to forget how much we depend on it. Then, as I mentioned, in the 70s, the water started getting better thanks to government regulation. Super news, because this river is the source of drinking water for cities around here. Today, Friends of the Kaw is the main nonprofit group focused on keeping the momentum of environmental improvement in this river basin. And Dawn is what's called the river keeper.
I'm required as a river keeper to monitor the river for pollution and for dumping. And so we monitor the river all year long.
Year-round, with the group's core volunteers, who are all skilled kayakers, looking for messes to clean up and making detailed inventories of all the decades-old legacy trash sites, like those dang battery cases.
There was a company, did not do anything illegal, They were recycling batteries for Fort Riley.
That's the nearby Army base.
Over 60 years ago. And then the cases, they were putting them in piles on their property.
And what may have happened next was the power of water. Water is strong, and all it would have taken was a big flood or the river changing its course a bit for all those cases to get into the river and lodge in sandbars.
You know, rivers move.
And there's another totally different reason behind a lot of these legacy trash sites.
Failed bank stabilization projects.
Failed stabilization. This happened on lots of streams and rivers.
So if you go back even into the 70s, but definitely the 60s and earlier, rural areas had no trash service. You either burned your trash, or when you had big things like appliances and cars, people put them on the banks of the river
to try to save their farmland from erosion.
Because it would stabilize the bank, or that's what they thought.
The other thing that they used was old tires. Dawn's dad remembered that back then, companies could offload used tires this way, giving them to farmers for free. But it turns out weighing down soil in this way doesn't stop erosion, because actually,
you need trees and deep-rooted grasses.
And so floods would just rip all these tires off the banks.
And then scatter them throughout the middle of the river.
Wash them downstream.
And embed them into sandbars.
And those tires are now one of the biggest headaches for Friends of the Kaw. Volunteers find them in clusters of like 500 tires each.
We have what we call the tire map. The tire map has all the sites that we know of.
So these legacy trash sites lay largely untouched for a long time. Then, about a decade ago, that's when Friends of the Kaw got all fired up. Like, what the heck? It does not have to be this way. And now,
we're well on our way.
Working through their list of all those legacy sites.
Knocking them off one by one.
And the payoff is really enjoying the natural beauty.
Huge difference.
Dawn and others recently paddled a stretch they had worked super hard on.
The sandbar's clean. It's beautiful. Beautiful golden braided sandbar.
But how are they doing this? I mean, 35 tons of battery cases so far?
The bulk of them are gone.
Thousands of tires?
We've removed 3,000 to 4,000 tires.
Doing all this, as you can imagine, takes a village. We will be right back to learn more about it. Okay, so you remember that grueling day in 2017 when Friends of the Kaw volunteers naively hauled 3,000 pounds of battery cases for like 9 miles in canoes? Most people would give up at that point. They just started gathering tips about resources, striking up conversations.
Yeah, people bumping into people.
The kind of people that they knew would probably care. And so they learned who to go to for what kind of help, and it paid off. The Kansas Department of Wildlife and Parks had airboats to ferry whole stacks of battery cases or tires at a time. And then there were companies like Evergy, a utility, and BHS, a construction company. And they had all this heavy equipment that could help. There were Rotary clubs willing to pitch in for things like dumpsters. Cities and counties brought trucks and trash bags. And the more people heard, the more they stepped up.
And said, how can I help? Let me help.
Kansas Backcountry Hunters and Anglers, the student environmental group at Kansas State University. Every extra pair of hands was welcome.
It's a lot of very hard physical labor.
And this patchwork greatly expanded what the core Friends of the Kaw volunteers could do. They weren't alone anymore. Now they could aim bigger.
They took apart a trailer with a hot saw underneath the 635 bridge.
They chopped up a great big septic tank near Ogden. And yeah, sometimes that means kayaking with chainsaws. What do you do, like strap them to the front of a kayak? Or
yes.
They hauled out the pieces of an old bridge in Lawrence. Why was there a bridge on the river?
Decades ago, long time ago, when you replaced a bridge and put up a new one, the old one just was dropped into the river. There are bridge remnants all along the river. There's some old rail cars between Bellevue and Topeka.
Okay, it's incredibly hard to get things like this in case that isn't totally obvious. It took dozens of people to get at that old bridge. They had to cut up the metal beams, ferry the pieces from the middle of the river to the banks, and use skid steers and a boom truck to haul them up the banks and get them onto trucks. But they made a big push in 2017 and then got extra help from a construction crew in 2020. And after all that bridge metal, it's finally gone.
And so it was a huge victory.
And when you hear about victories like this, you start to understand why Friends of the Kaw got up the courage to set a goal of 2030 for wiping out its list of legacy sites. Trash and water pollution more broadly are issues where it's easy to succumb to pessimism, which is why it's worth celebrating the wins and why I want you to hear from a small slice of the people who love this river enough to make those wins happen. I met them in March. The water was 50 degrees, and there they were tromping around in it, pulling out several hundred more tires near DeSoto.
I got one. The river's a living thing. There's just so much to see out here from a stealthy, quiet kayak. Herons, muskrat, reptiles, amphibians, everything comes to water. You can sneak up really close to coyotes.
Turkeys, goldfinches.
Blue suckers are really cool.
I got 3 kids, and so we spend a lot of time flipping over rocks.
Keep going down the bend, and there's always something new.
That's kind of my church, I guess, and I go out and I enjoy all the nature that has been given to us.
It feels very wild. This river, even inside Kansas City, it feels really wild.
When the migrations are happening or when the pelicans are out, it just has a very National Geographic wildlife feel to it. The trees are really thick. You feel like you're miles from anything. Beavers sliding down the side.
I've traveled all over the U.S. looking for wilderness areas to hike, and we have this wilderness area right here in our backyard.
I think it was July 2020. We did the whole river. Took us 9 days.
Well, it's a national river trail.
Sandbar camping, some of the best camping I've had.
By the time you've been camping on the river for 4 or 5 nights, you can't imagine being anywhere else.
There's always driftwood. You build a big bonfire and you sit and you watch the sun go down. When I found out the mission was to help clean it up, I jumped in and I've been on tire cleanups.
It provides drinking water for over 950,000 Kansans.
This is my home, and it's the home of people before me and people after me.
How do you feel when you're hauling out 400 tires in a day?
How I feel physically? It's a good pain, kind of like going to the gym.
Feels really good. Instant gratification.
Every tire we pull out is a tire we don't see the next time we paddle. It makes the next day when you're a little bit tired and sore even better.
395 tires just in this little area. We took out a bunch in Kansas City a couple of years ago, a whole semi-truck full.
Yeah, thank you.
Feels like we're helping out wildlife, the fish and everything, getting the chemicals levels to reduce.
If you look back and reflect how things were, 10, 20 years ago, that's when you're really like, wow, things have really improved. If people choose to protect something, they can.
That was Lynn Beatty, Kim Mahana-Bellemere, David McLean, Lisa Grossman, Martin Weiser, Bill Hughes, Joe Sevchik, Steve Garrett, David Sane, and Lynanne Llewellyn with Friends of the Kaw, game wardens for the state of Kansas, Melissa Skelton and Jeff Klauser, Caleb Hastings from Evergy's Green Team, and Malik Nash from Garney Construction. Now, try to hold on to some of their positive energy. We will need that while Dawn explains this next part. Tell me then about these eddies.
Downstream of every major city on the Kansas River, there is an eddy full of plastic trash.
Plastic, especially single use.
Water bottles, Coke bottles, plastic straws.
Eddies are pockets in the river where the water flow slows down, swirls or stills, a break from the downstream flow. And they're important. Fish can rest there. They can kind of eye the stream flow for food. But eddies are also exactly where our plastic gathers.
Downstream of Manhattan, downstream of Topeka, downstream of Lawrence. We cleaned one downstream of Manhattan last fall. This huge area, the bottles are layered upon layered, so they're not just on the surface. There's so many crammed in there. You're in a kayak because there's no way to get them from land, and you're having to try and scoop them or hand pick them up.
Plastic was an incredible invention for a lot of reasons, but boy, are we addicted. And the single-use stuff, in particular, is out of control and has been since the 60s or so, ever since plastic makers retooled and rebranded the stuff from this durable material that we were meant to use for a lifetime into something we could endlessly toss and replace. And especially in the past decade, Friends of the Caw just sees more and more of it on the river.
And it's harder to clean up, to be honest with you.
It breaks down into microplastics that you've no doubt heard by now are everywhere. But the story behind these eddies can help us understand how each one of us can really help our rivers. Let's follow a single candy wrapper.
Go to any gas station, especially on the weekend,
and just look at those outdoor trash bins.
They are overflowing
with garbage like our candy wrapper. And so
all it takes is the wind to blow,
and voila, our wrapper flutters off. It's skittering across the parking lot.
And it's making its way to the nearest river.
And yeah, it's miles away from the river still, but that is where it's headed. Because a river is like Rome. Everything leads to it. That's how watersheds work. In the whole 60,000 square mile Kansas River basin that we noted covers part of Colorado and Nebraska and half of Kansas, the Kansas River is where all the pavement runoff, the rivulets, the ditches, the creeks and streams, where they're all headed. And the eddies in the river tell the tale of our disposable living.
Everything accumulates until a big storm or the river rises enough that it pushes it all out and sends it downstream. Now, as the river drops, it'll get caught in new places.
So it's like this plastic is hopping eddy to eddy down the Kansas River and someday to the Missouri River and then the Mississippi River and then the Gulf of Mexico.
Absolutely. Our goal is to make sure that Kansas sends as little as possible downstream. We'd like to take care of our own trash here in our own space, but we really need the public's help to do it.
How do we do that? 1, cutting back on plastic.
None of us are purists, but I think we all can try to reduce how much we use as much as possible.
2, disposing of it better. Emptying outdoor trash cans before they overflow. 3, picking up other people's trash. Most volunteers that join Friends of the Caw events actually don't even get into the water. They scour the land along the river, like parks and such, to snatch all that litter before the next gust of wind does, because it's headed to that eddy.
It's headed to the eddy.
Today, dozens of people, sometimes a few hundred, will turn out for these cleanup events, which is so helpful because the litter is daunting, relentless. Still, it's helpful to reflect on how the Clean Water Act transformed the Kansas River half a century ago.
When I talk to my family about it, and they explain how absolutely horrible the water quality was, I feel how far we've come.
And she thinks about how sandbars actually look like sandbars again, thanks to so many people banding together to dig out tires and chop up septic tanks.
Like, I gotta tell you, it's like the highlight. It feels so good to know that stuff is gone and to know that I'm not gonna leave that to my grandson.
Pollution can seem impossible to tackle, but the alternative of doing nothing is absurd. And there is momentum on the issue of plastic. Some communities are getting fed up with the uglier side of it, and they're rethinking, and in some cases reining in, just how much they depend on plastic bags and other single-use items.
What gives me hope is when individual cities make decisions to reduce their single-use plastic. I mean, sometimes you go and get food and you don't even ask for all of those things and they wind up in the bag. We can reduce it. We can go back to using stainless steel forks, those kinds of things. And you actually see that people will survive without all the plastic. We'll be okay.
Up From Dust is a production of KCUR Studios and the Kansas News Service, aka the NPR stations of Kansas that I am so proud to be a part of. This episode was reported, written, and mixed by me, Celia Llopis-Jepsen. My editors are Mackenzie Martin and Stephen Koranda. A couple notes. I mentioned how bad access to the Kansas River used to be. Today, there are 19 public boat ramps. Friends of the Caw had a hand in that change too, and it is working to keep increasing public access. Also, if you want to help clean the river, Friends of the Caw posts its events on Facebook. They also teach people to kayak and do other cool things around water. Thank you, Battalion Chief Rich Stevens and your colleagues at the Northwest Consolidated Fire District in DeSoto for taking me by airboat to cover a tire cleanup in the middle of the river. Thanks also to Suzanne Hogan, Gabe Rosenberg, and Genevieve Demarteau. Artist Jessica Corneliuson created our podcast logo. Music is provided by David Condos, Tom Lonnie, Milktooth, and Blue Dot Sessions. Next time on Up From Dust, we aren't done talking about microplastics, so come back to meet scientists determined to help and hear about the happy accident that led them down this path. Until then, thanks for listening.